find out what happened when the USS Cyclops sailed into the Bermuda Triangle with over 300 souls on board and was never seen or heard from again.
Baltimore Harbor was coming to life in a thick, almost tangible fog that crawled across the cold, oily water like a living, breathing organism, swallowing the silhouettes of smaller vessels and blurring the boundaries between land and the restless sea. In the heart of this industrial chaos, rising above the docks like a sleeping god of iron and steam, lay the USS Cyclops, a Proteus-class coal ship that was an absolute and undisputed triumph of early 20th century American naval engineering. Its massive hull, over 165 meters long, was a massive, impenetrable wall of gray riveted steel that seemed to absorb any light trying to penetrate the morning grayness. In an age when the power of nations was measured in tons of displacement and the amount of coal burned, the Cyclops was not just a ship, but a true floating monument of industrial power, a machine designed with ruthless precision to feed the insatiable furnaces of war across the world's oceans. When viewed from the quayside, it was almost religiously awe-inspiring, its gigantic silhouette dominating the horizon and the forest of massive steel cranes and loading booms protruding from the deck like the exposed ribs of some prehistoric monster reminded us that this was an instrument of titanic work, not a luxury liner. Every rivet, every steel plate, every rope screamed of the power of the human mind that had managed to harness the elements and contain them within this colossal floating fortress.
The architecture of this ship was austere, devoid of any decorations, subordinated solely to one purpose, carrying unimaginable amounts of cargo through the most treacherous waters on the planet. The coal ship's holds could hold 10,000 tons of black gold, making it a strategic point on the Navy's logistical map, and its role was as crucial as that of the dreadnoughts it was intended to supply. With each wave crashing against its mighty, immovable hull, the USS Cyclops reminded the world of man's domination over nature, awakening in the hearts of observers a deep, almost instinctive respect for a machine that seemed indestructible, resistant to all the whims of the ocean and ruthless in its steel perfection. 1918 was a time when the entire planet seemed to hold its breath, and Europe burned in the flames of the Great War, the echoes of which reached even to the eastern seaboard of the United States, turning every port into a nervous center of feverish preparations. Even though Cyclops was thousands of miles from the trenches of Flanders and the muddy battlefields of France, the atmosphere on the docks was permeated with a heavy, almost suffocating tension that could be felt in every cry of the longshoremen and every creak of chains.
The Atlantic Ocean, once a trade route full of promise, now became a graveyard, a dark hunting ground for German submarines, which silently hunted Allied convoys, sending thousands of tons of iron and human lives to the bottom. In this climate of ever-present danger, every voyage, no matter how routine it might seem in peacetime, carried with it the unspeakable burden of potential disaster. And the loading of coal and manganese aboard the Cyclops took place in the shadow of constant threat. The ominous rumblings of war shaped the mood of the entire crew. No one said it aloud, but everyone, from the youngest sailor to the most experienced officer, realized that leaving the safe harbor meant entering an arena where one mistake, one misinterpreted figure on the horizon, could mean instant death in the icy embrace of the ocean. This tension was compounded by the nature of the cargo itself. The ship was packed to the brim, its waterline dipping dangerously with each ton dumped into its cavernous holes, making maneuvering this lumbering behemoth in the event of an attack a near impossible task. The men working on the wharf moved with nervous energy, as if they wanted to push this floating gunpowder magazine away from their city as quickly as possible, placing responsibility for its fate in the hands of the endless sea and Providence.
The smell of burning coal,
Damp rust and salt water mixed with the sweat of hundreds of workers, creating a suffocating industrial perfume that would forever associate witnesses with those last hours before unmooring, when the line between routine and mortal danger became alarmingly thin. Aboard this floating city was a diverse mosaic of over 300 human souls, each carrying their own history, their own fears, and their own reasons for finding themselves aboard the metal decks of the Cyclops at such an uncertain time. Among them was the old bosun, Thomas, a man whose face was deeply wrinkled like a map of unknown archipelagos, and whose eyes, faded from decades of staring at the blinding sunlight reflecting off the waves, saw the passage from the age of noble sailing ships to the soulless age of steam and steel. For him, the Cyclops was not a technological marvel, but a cold, merciless monster in which there was no place for the old romanticism of navigation. Steel did not breathe like wood, did not sing in the wind, but only groaned dully under the pressure of the ocean, and the vibrations of powerful steam engines constantly reminded him that he was only a cog in a gigantic mechanism. Thomas paced the deck, checking the tension of the ropes and the condition of the boats securing the hold lids, and his hands, as hard as leather, felt every slight deviation from the norm with mechanical precision, although deep inside he felt a growing irrational anxiety that he could not rationalize.
This anxiety was completely alien to young recruits like 18-year-old William from rural Ohio, for whom the sight of the ocean was a novelty so shocking it was half paralyzing. The boy stood at the rail, clutching his thin duffel bag, eyes wide, staring at the vastness of the ship and the vastness of the dark water. For William, this cruise was his first real adventure, an escape from the monotony of farm work. But when faced with the vastness of the steel colossus, his youthful enthusiasm quickly gave way to a feeling of utter insignificance and overwhelming loneliness. In turn, the passengers, who included U.S. Consul General Alfred Gottschalk, created a dissonance of civilian luxury and diplomatic importance on board as they walked in their clean coats among the coal-smeared sailors. Their presence intensified the surreal nature of the entire situation. Civilians, unaware of the brutal laws governing life at sea, trusted completely in engineering and procedures, not realizing that in the clash with the merciless element, no passport or diplomatic title has the slightest importance, and everyone is equal before the power of the ocean. Descending down to the very heart of this steel leviathan, one could get the impression of descending into Dante's hell, where the temperature reached the limits of human endurance, and the noise of steam engines was so deafening that any voice communication was impossible.
In the engine room, surrounded by a maze of hissing pipes, huge valves, and vibrating boilers, worked the stokers, people covered with a thick, sticky layer of black coal dust, sweat, and grease, looking in the red glow of open furnaces like damned condemned to eternal hardship. Their muscles tensed to the limit with every movement of the shovel as they continually fed the ship's insatiable stomachs with thousands of pounds of coal to maintain the steam pressure necessary to move the gigantic propellers. It was here, deep below the waterline, cut off from sunlight and fresh air, that these people were the true powerhouse of the ship, and their murderous, exhausting work was the foundation on which the entire logistics mission of the Navy was based. The air in the holds and engine rooms was thick, saturated with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and exhaust gases, which created a claustrophobic atmosphere completely different from that prevailing on the open decks. Here, everyone was aware that in the event of a torpedo or rupture of the plating, they had absolutely no chance of rescue, trapped in a steel cage at the very bottom. Despite this, the engine room buzzed with life, like a great iron rhythmic organ, the powerful pulse of the triple expansion of the steam engines spreading through the frames and bulkheads throughout the hull, setting the ship in a constant hypnotic vibration that became something like the heartbeat of this dark, mechanical deity. It was in this dark, hot underbelly of the ship that one could fully understand that the USS Cyclops was not just a collection of sheet metal and rivets, but an organism devouring matter and spitting smoke, powerful, but at the same time requiring constant, slavish service from its creators. Over time, however, as the ship sank deeper and deeper into the harbor waters under the weight of its swallowed cargo, that initial, exhilarating admiration for human genius began to slowly and inexorably give way to a feeling of creeping, cold anxiety. The power of the ship began to appear not as a guarantee of safety, but as arrogance, pride thrown in the face of the unpredictable forces of nature that have been punishing man for overconfidence in the waters of the oceans since the dawn of time. The huge open hatches of the hold looked like bottomless black holes into which tons of raw material fell with a deafening roar, and each creak of the hull straining under the gargantuan weight seemed to be a quiet, warning moan of tormented matter asking for mercy. Instead of dissipating as the sun rose, the fog grew thicker and thicker, enveloping the ship in a gray, sticky veil that distorted the perspective and caused the enormous crane arm to disappear into the mist, resembling a gigantic severed limb hanging in nothingness.
The crew became increasingly quiet as conversations and jokes died down, replaced by nervous, evasive glances, as if everyone present was beginning to sense a subtle change in the aura surrounding the vessel, as if the ship itself was emanating a heavy, grave melancholy. These moments before sailing were suspended in time, filled with that specific, suffocating tension that appears just before a lightning strike, when the air is so charged with electricity that it stings the lungs, and the slightest sound resonates with a redoubled, disturbing force. Then, at the very top of this hierarchy, on the captain's bridge, which was the brain and command center of the entire unit, the silence was even more eloquent, broken only by the faint ticking of chronometers and the whisper of the wind washing over the thick windows of the wheelhouse. The bridge was a realm of rigor and precision, gleaming brass and polished mahogany, where the machine telegraph stood proud in the center, ready to transmit orders that would set thousands of tons of still life in motion. It was in this place, towering above the rest of the ship, that decisions about life and death were made, and the navigation instruments, compasses and sextants waited in sleep for their master, the only man who had the right to dictate the will of this steel monster.
When the heavy brass door leading to the bridge opened with a dull creak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and the officers present in the wheelhouse immediately, with instinctive synchronization, straightened to attention, breaking all tangles of thoughts. Through the door stepped Captain George W. Worley, a figure so inextricably linked with the ship's reputation that in the minds of the crew they were one inseparable entity, ruled by a firm iron fist and an unforgiving maritime code. Worley was a man with a powerful, almost bear-like frame, whose mere physical presence filled the space with dominance. His face was hard, fierce, worn by wind and salt, and his eyes, cold and piercing as the ice on the North Sea, seemed to see through every man searching for the slightest sign of weakness. Dressed in his characteristic slightly sloppy manner, with his inseparable cane in his hand, for which he had a weakness, and an old hat covering his graying head, he did not resemble a typical, well-groomed naval officer at all, but rather resembled a pirate from old, brutal stories about forbidden ports. His reputation far preceded him, circulating on the decks of ships in dark rumors and whispers about his fiery temper and punishments meted out for the slightest offenses, with a sadism befitting the captains of old who ruled by the whip and fear of the keel.
In a navy that was slowly transitioning to more civilized methods of command, Worley appeared as a relic of a brutal, ruthless past, a man for whom compassion was a sign of incompetence and absolute obedience the only acceptable currency in relationships with his subordinates. Many of these stories concerned his supposedly German roots. It was whispered that he was born Johann Friedrich Wickmann, which in the era of war paranoia aroused additional, deeply hidden suspicions and lack of trust on the part of the crew, who were forced to entrust their lives to a man with a double identity. But no one dared question his navigation skills and ability to keep the ship afloat. He was brutal, eccentric, and terrifying, but in the eyes of his superiors, he got the cargo where it was needed, regardless of storms and threats. Worley stood at the bridge windows, resting his weight on his walking stick and staring out at the fog-covered quay, his face absolutely impenetrable, devoid of any human emotion, like a mask carved in granite. There was a chilling silence for a long moment as the captain surveyed the people bustling around below as if they were nothing more than insignificant insects crawling on the armor of his personal Leviathan.
Suddenly, with a hoarse, booming voice like the scrape of rusting iron on iron, Worley gave the first order that cut through the dead silence on the bridge like the crack of a whip, immediately setting the entire human machinery into frantic, terrified movement. Spotting a young sailor who was too slow to secure one of the foredeck tarpaulins as he leaned over the bridge wing, Worley roared with a fury that seemed to shake the very air, hurling a torrent of insults at the boy and threatening him with the most severe penalties in the code if he didn't do his job correctly this second. This brief but extremely brutal demonstration of power immediately defined the tone of the entire upcoming voyage. There was no room for error. There was no mercy. There was only the ship, the cargo, and the captain, whose will was absolute and indisputable law. This event, like a cold shower, washed away the remnants of any optimism from the hearts of the witnesses, replacing it with paralyzing fear and the awareness that in the face of the harshness of the sea and Worley's authoritarianism, they were on their own, locked in an iron prison from which there was no escape. The preparations for the final unberthing suddenly took on a frantic, desperate pace, as if each crew member wanted to escape the captain's gaze as quickly as possible, performing their duties with mechanical, mindless precision, fueled by pure adrenaline. Huge mooring lines, thick over an adult man's shoulder, began to be dropped from the deck and fell into the dirty port water with a dull splash, thus breaking the last physical ties connecting the USS Cyclops with the safety and stability of the mainland. When the officer at the bow raised the flag signaling the last ropes had been released and the ship's mighty siren blared, a sound so low and vibrating that it sent tremors through the bones of every man within a mile, the handle fell forever. Telegraph bells rang in the engine room, stokers threw tons more of coal into the fire, and giant bronze propellers began to spin majestically in the black water, whipping it into a thick white foam and pushing thousands of tons of dead weight toward the open sea. The ship, at first reluctantly and lazily, began to move along the quay, and the powerful vibrations of the working machines spread throughout the hull, making it clear that the Iron Behemoth had finally woken up and was setting out on a hunt from which it may never return. The moment of unmooring always carried a specific note of regret and finality, but this time, in the thick gray fog and under the heavy gaze of the commander heralding misfortune, this feeling intensified into a growing nightmare.
As the USS Cyclops moved further away from the docks, deeper and deeper into the thick veil of impenetrable coastal fog, its titanic silhouette became less and less distinct, gradually losing its three-dimensional character and turning into a dark, two-dimensional shadow against the gray sky. The water in front of the bow parted with a dull roar, and the black smoke billowing from the chimneys immediately mixed with the fog, creating a dirty, tarry cloud that trailed behind the ship like a mournful veil, heralding a grim fate. To those few who stood on the shore and observed this phenomenon, the ship seemed to be literally being swallowed by nothingness, as if crossing the border between the world of the living and some other cold and merciless dimension from which there was no way back. The last thing visible was the silhouette of the massive deck cranes looming in the distance, like the bones of a huge skeleton sinking into the murky depths of the ocean. And then the ship disappeared completely, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur, oil, and the echo of the retreating, pulsating engine. This sense of blurring of the contours of reality, this awareness that several hundred souls in a closed, armored shell are heading into the maw of the raging element and the conflagration of war, commanded by a merciless tyrant, closed the emotional chain of this scene. The original, pride-building admiration for the magnificence of human engineering and the power of steel had evaporated forever, giving way to the absolute, primal, overwhelming premonition of the inevitable catastrophe that would seal the fate of the USS Cyclops in the annals of the greatest maritime mysteries in the history of the world.
The USS Cyclops was not merely a vessel of the United States Navy. It was a sprawling, floating iron purgatory that carved its agonizing way through the unforgiving, desaturated expanses of the Atlantic Ocean, carrying within its cold metallic belly a deeply tragic microcosm of human misery, profound paranoia, and rapidly festering resentment. At the absolute epicenter of this nautical nightmare, casting a suffocating and oppressive shadow over every single inch of the colossal collier's rusted decks, stood the deeply despised commander, Captain George W. Worley. The everyday visual reality of the ship was one of stark, depressing, and brutal utility, a confined world painted in cold slate grays, deep abyssal blues, and harsh metallic blacks, where the only tangible textures were the abrasive, lung-choking grit of ubiquitous coal dust and the slippery, life-threatening danger of salty sea spray freezing solid on the uneven steel grates. Amidst this bleak and unforgiving canvas, Worley was a violently incongruous and profoundly terrifying figure, a walking anomaly who utterly rejected the crisp, immaculate, and stabilizing traditions of standard naval uniform in favor of a bizarre, deeply unsettling, and fiercely guarded personal attire that mocked military decorum. He relentlessly stalked the agonizingly long, narrow walkways of the ship, draped in a heavy, voluminous, dark overcoat that billowed aggressively in the turbulent, howling ocean winds like the leathery wings of a massive carrion bird, his head crowned absurdly yet menacingly by a stiff, immaculate black bowler hat that looked like an artifact from a gloomy Victorian fever dream. This eccentric and defiant wardrobe did not invite quiet mockery or muffled laughter from the ranks. Rather, it firmly cemented his chilling image as a highly unpredictable, volatile tyrant, a solitary commander entirely untethered from the stabilizing protocols, ethical restraints, and brotherhood of the Navy he supposedly served. To the thoroughly exhausted, grease-stained, and perpetually shivering enlisted crew who desperately scrubbed the iron bulkheads and hauled heavy, freezing hemp ropes under skies that perpetually threatened violent storms, that black bowler hat, bobbing silently through the thick, salty fog, was the ultimate harbinger of arbitrary doom, a haunting visual trigger that sent immediate spikes of raw, unfiltered adrenaline and pure terror straight into their frantic hearts. The overall atmosphere aboard the doomed Cyclops was incredibly heavy, perpetually damp and terrifyingly claustrophobic, deeply infused with the constant, grinding, rhythmic groan of the massive steam engines and the relentless, violent crashing of dark, foamy waves against the unyielding hull. But the true crushing weight that broke the spirits of the men came directly from the profound psychological isolation deliberately imposed by a paranoid captain who viewed his crew not as fellow human beings or loyal sailors, but as deeply flawed, inherently treacherous mechanisms existing solely to be broken, endlessly punished, mercilessly corrected, and universally despised.
The psychological weight of Worley's physical presence on the ship was an almost tangible, suffocating force that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the freezing, salt-tainted air whenever he stepped out of his isolated quarters and onto the weather-beaten deck. His daily, erratic pacings were not the steady, reassuring inspections of a confident leader ensuring the seaworthiness of his beloved vessel, but rather the restless, predatory prowling of a caged, highly suspicious beast desperately looking for the slightest excuse to unleash a torrent of disproportionate fury upon its hapless victims. As he walked, he carried a heavy, polished walking cane, an object entirely alien to the rolling, treacherous decks of a collier at sea, which he would rhythmically and menacingly tap against the iron bulkheads, the steel grates, and the thick glass of the skylights, creating a sharp, staccato rhythm that echoed through the misty corridors like the ticking of a macabre clock counting down to someone's inevitable ruin. The sharp clack, clack, clack of the hard cane striking metal cut through the ambient roaring noise of the turbulent sea and the thrumming engines, serving as an agonizing acoustic warning system that sent sheer panic cascading through the ranks of the enlisted men who scrambled desperately to look busy, invisible, or utterly devoid of any individual personality. The sheer, unadulterated terror of the common sailors attempting to perform utterly mundane, routine maritime tasks while his cold, unblinking, and deeply suspicious eyes bored into their shivering backs was a profound psychological torture that wore down their mental fortitude faster than the corrosive sea salt ate away at the ship's exterior paint. A sailor merely swabbing the deck or securing a loose canvas tarp would find his hands trembling uncontrollably, sweat mingling with the freezing ocean spray on his forehead, knowing with absolute terrifying certainty that if the captain's arbitrary and capricious mood soured in that precise microscopic fraction of a second, the consequences would be swift, merciless, and entirely out of proportion to whatever imaginary infraction Worley's deeply paranoid mind had suddenly conjured. The men lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing hypervigilance, their nervous systems frayed to the absolute breaking point, jumping at shadows and whispering in hushed, terrified tones, deeply aware that their commander took a perverse, almost sadistic delight in cultivating this toxic atmosphere of absolute, paralyzing fear, preferring the forced, trembling obedience of deeply terrified subjects over the genuine, earned respect of capable, professional seamen. Far below the bleak, fog-shrouded weather decks, in the absolute bowels of the massive steel Leviathan, the deeply entrenched issues of the Cyclops morphed from a chilling psychological thriller into a sweltering, chaotic, and dangerously explosive cultural powder keg that threatened to rip the ship apart from the inside out long before any enemy torpedo could find its mark. The boiler rooms and immense coal bunkers were a literal and figurative hellscape, a suffocating, hyperheated underworld where the air was thick enough to chew, heavily laden with toxic black dust, the overwhelming stench of burning coal, and the pungent, unmistakable odor of stale, desperate human sweat pouring off men pushed to the absolute limits of their physical endurance. Here, the crew was a chaotic, poorly integrated, multicultural melting pot, a desperate assemblage of recent immigrants, seasoned sailors, and inexperienced farm boys, heavily populated by Greeks, Italians,
Eastern Europeans and native-born Americans, many of whom spoke entirely different languages and possessed deeply ingrained cultural animosities that only required a single spark to ignite into bloody violence. Under the steady, fair hand of a competent and empathetic commander, this diverse mix of strong men might have.
To truly understand the depths of the agonizing hatred the crew harbored for their captain, one only had to whisper the name of a young, inexperienced Greek seaman named Kostas, whose deeply tragic, entirely preventable ordeal had become a dark, widely circulated legend of horrific cruelty, permanently etched into the collective traumatized memory of the Cyclops' battered crew. The incident had begun over an infraction so infinitesimally minor, so entirely inconsequential to the vast, complex operation of the mighty naval collier, that under normal circumstances it would have warranted nothing more than a brief, mildly annoyed verbal correction from a passing petty officer. The exhausted boy, blinded by a sudden stinging wave of freezing ocean spray, had accidentally spilled a very small, insignificant amount of dark, lubricating grease onto a freshly scrubbed section of the starboard weather deck. Unfortunately for the shivering, terrified youth, Captain Worley had been silently lurking in the dense yellowish fog nearby, enveloped in his signature dark overcoat and bowler hat, observing the minor accident with eyes that instantly flared with a sudden, completely unhinged, and terrifyingly disproportionate rage that seemed to entirely bypass all logic, reason, and standard military protocol. Worley did not simply reprimand the boy, he descended upon him like a wrathful, completely unhinged demigod, screaming highly abusive, deeply degrading insults in a bizarre, frighteningly erratic cadence, his face turning an alarming shade of mottled crimson as he wildly struck the steel bulkhead with his heavy walking cane, the sharp, violent cracks echoing loudly over the howling wind like rapid gunfire. The captain accused the trembling, weeping Greek sailor of deliberate, malicious sabotage, loudly declaring to the gathering, deeply terrified onlookers that this tiny accidental spill was a calculated, treacherous act of outright mutiny, designed to humiliate the command and dangerously compromise the absolute safety of the entire vessel in a time of looming global conflict. The sheer, overwhelming intensity of Worley's psychotic outburst paralyzed the entire deck. Strong, battle-hardened men stood entirely frozen, their breath catching in their tight throats, absolutely powerless to intervene as they watched a grown man, vested with the absolute, godlike authority of a naval captain, systematically and ruthlessly tear down a terrified, defenseless subordinate over a meaningless stain on the deck, firmly establishing a permanent atmosphere where basic human mistakes were treated as high treason. The punishment that immediately followed this terrifying, unhinged outburst was entirely devoid of any standard military justice, standing as a stark, horrifying testament to Worley's deep-seated sadism and his absolute, unwavering intent to mentally and physically break the spirit of any man unfortunate enough to draw his violently erratic attention. Refusing to utilize the standard, regulated disciplinary procedures outlined by naval law, Worley ordered the young Greek seaman completely stripped of his heavy protective foul weather gear, leaving him clad only in a thin, entirely inadequate cotton undershirt and damp trousers, and commanded him to stand at rigid attention on the most exposed, violently wind-battered section of the forward deck. For 12 agonizing, uninterrupted hours, as the massive ship violently pitched and heavily rolled through rough, freezing Atlantic swells, the boy was forced to stand absolutely motionless while freezing, salty spray relentlessly battered his rapidly numbing body, turning his skin a horrifying, translucent shade of sickly blue and causing his limbs to tremble with highly dangerous, uncontrollable, violent spasms of deep hypothermia.
Worley himself would periodically emerge from the warm, insulated comfort of his private cabin, sipping hot, aromatic coffee from a delicate porcelain cup, simply to coldly stare at the suffering, slowly dying sailor, offering no words of reprimand, only a silent, deeply menacing glare that silently communicated his absolute, unquestionable power over life, death, and human dignity aboard the floating iron prison. The rest of the crew, strictly forbidden from offering a warm blanket, a sip of water, or even a sympathetic glance under severe threat of receiving the exact same torturous fate, were forced to go about their agonizing daily duties while actively witnessing the slow, systematic, and entirely deliberate torture of their helpless comrade. A deeply traumatic experience that universally shattered any remaining illusions of fairness, justice, or basic human decency aboard the doomed vessel. By the time the brutally excessive punishment finally concluded and the young man collapsed onto the freezing steel grates, deeply unconscious and dangerously close to death, a profound, completely irreversible shift had permanently occurred deep within the collective psyche of the crew. The scattered seeds of intense resentment had instantly bloomed into a deeply rooted, fiercely burning garden of pure, unadulterated hatred, transforming the Cyclops from a standard naval collier into a highly volatile, massively pressurized containment vessel of seething, murderous intent. The highly toxic, completely unbreathable atmosphere of fear and resentment was absolutely not confined to the dark, sweaty bowels of the ship or the freezing, spray-battered weather decks. It heavily permeated the supposedly refined, heavily insulated bulkheads of the officers' wardroom, an enclosed, claustrophobic space that reeked intensely of stale cigar smoke, bitter black coffee, and the deeply suppressed, heavily censored outrage of educated, professional men forced to serve under a man they universally considered a profound, dangerous lunatic. The commissioned officers, deeply proud men who had spent grueling years rigorously studying complex naval architecture, advanced celestial navigation, and the strict, honorable traditions of maritime leadership at prestigious academies, found themselves in a state of constant, agonizing psychological distress, suffering the ultimate professional indignity of being aggressively commanded by a former merchant mariner whose deeply erratic methods and outright rejection of standard naval protocol violently offended their deepest professional sensibilities. Gathered tightly around a felt-lined table covered in complex navigation charts, illuminated only by the sickly, swinging yellow glow of heavy brass gimbal lamps, officers like Lieutenant Forbes.
However, far beyond the incredibly severe friction caused by his tyrannical, highly abusive management style and his bizarre, eccentric personal behavior, there lay a far darker, infinitely more dangerous suspicion that deeply infected the minds of the crew like a virulent, highly contagious psychological plague, dominating every hushed, terrified conversation in the dark corners of the ship. The deeply unsettling, deeply terrifying question of Captain Worley's true fundamental loyalties as the dark, massive shadow of the First World War aggressively loomed over the perilous ocean. It was a widely known, heavily discussed fact among the highly paranoid men that Captain George W. Worley was not born an American citizen, but had originally entered the world in Imperial Germany under the distinctly foreign, deeply suspicious name of Georg Wichmann, a stark, undeniable biographical detail that, in the highly charged, massively xenophobic atmosphere of a world teetering on the absolute brink of total global conflict, was heavily viewed not as mere trivial background information, but as highly damning, absolutely conclusive proof of inherent treachery.
as completely unverified rumors rapidly spread like uncontrolled wildfire through the tightly cramped, heavily sweating crew quarters. The intensely suspicious men began to heavily scrutinize absolutely every single action, every minor decision, and every spoken word the captain uttered, aggressively looking for the slightest infinitesimal hint of secret pro-German sympathies, eagerly twisting his deeply abrasive personality into absolute proof of a hidden, highly treasonous agenda designed to ultimately doom the American ship. When Worley flew into one of his legendary, deeply terrifying, completely unhinged rages, fiercely screaming highly abusive obscenities at his utterly terrified subordinates, the deeply paranoid crew claimed they could clearly hear the harsh, guttural, unmistakable cadences of his native German accent violently bleeding through his thinly disguised adopted American persona. Viewing these brief linguistic slips not as a natural product of immense stress, but as the incredibly dangerous, terrifyingly real monster briefly dropping its carefully constructed, highly deceptive mask. The intense, overwhelming fear of highly advanced, totally invisible German U-boats silently prowling the dark, freezing Atlantic was universally compounded by the utterly paralyzing, nightmare-inducing thought that the very man definitively tasked with safely navigating them through these extremely perilous, deeply hostile waters might actively be secretly colluding with the unseen enemy, actively desiring the ultimate destruction of the massive collier and the agonizing death of every supposedly loyal American soul trapped on board. This profound, deeply rotting suspicion transformed the ship from a highly unified military vessel into a deeply fractured, highly paranoid floating asylum where absolutely no one could be completely trusted, and the man holding the absolute unquestionable keys to their ultimate survival was universally deeply suspected of actively plotting their tragic, inevitable demise, ensuring that absolute terror was the only constant companion on their dark voyage. The sheer, overwhelming intensity of this deeply rooted crew-wide suspicion profoundly exacerbated Worley's own deeply entrenched, rapidly spiraling paranoia, entirely locking the captain and his desperately exhausted crew in a highly toxic, continuously escalating psychological death spiral, where absolutely every single action was heavily interpreted through a deeply distorted, highly suspicious lens of absolute malice and hidden treachery. Believing with absolute psychotic certainty that a massive, highly organized, deeply secretive mutiny was constantly actively brewing in the dark, sweltering shadows of the lower decks, Worley completely ceased to function as a rational, logical naval command.
Down in the incredibly cramped, horribly unventilated, and intensely foul-smelling confines of the heavily crowded mess deck, the complete and total physical and psychological degradation of the highly diverse enlisted men manifested in deeply visceral, highly disturbing ways that completely bypassed standard military discipline and deeply bordered on total, unrecoverable primal desperation and profound misery. The extremely low-quality food they were constantly forced to consume was absolutely atrocious, frequently severely infested with highly repulsive, deeply disturbing writhing weevils, terribly heavily salted to violently mask the highly dangerous, pungent taste of advanced rotting spoilage, and utterly lacking any basic necessary nutritional value, a highly deliberate, deeply cruel daily insult that the deeply paranoid enlisted men universally believed was completely intentional, a deeply malicious, highly calculated starvation tactic directly ordered by Worley to deliberately keep them physically weak, severely lethargic, and entirely incapable of organizing any highly physical resistance. As the deeply exhausted, completely hollow-eyed men sat tightly huddled around the highly sticky,
heavily stained wooden tables, aggressively choking down the truly vile, deeply offensive rations. They constantly nervously communicated entirely through highly secretive, deeply loaded glances, highly expressive subtle gestures, and deeply hushed, highly cautious whispers spoken in heavy, thickly accented broken English. Their desperately shared, completely overwhelming hatred for the crazed captain, heavily serving as the sole, highly powerful unifying force among deeply divided, highly antagonistic ethnic groups. The incredibly dangerous, highly taboo word mutiny was no longer merely a deeply abstract, highly theoretical concept completely forbidden by absolute naval law. It had fully become a distinctly living, heavily breathing, extremely dangerous entity that silently lurked menacingly in the dark, sweltering shadows of the damp room. A highly desperate, completely plausible dark fantasy that offered the absolute only conceivable highly violent escape from their deeply ongoing, utterly relentless nautical nightmare. The sheer incredible volume of absolute, deeply concentrated, totally unadulterated hatred heavily present in that cramped room created a highly tangible, intensely vibrating static in the suffocating air, a profoundly dangerous, deeply unstable emotional pressure heavily building against the ship's rusty bulkheads, completely mirroring the intensely dangerous, highly volatile physical pressure of the massive, highly reactive engines relentlessly burning deep below them. It was completely, undeniably evident to absolutely anyone possessing even a fraction of standard human empathy that the totally exhausted, deeply broken men were rapidly, aggressively approaching a highly dangerous, completely irreversible breaking point, firmly transforming the heavy, oppressive atmosphere into an incredibly volatile, deeply terrifying scenario where even the absolute slightest, entirely accidental provocation could instantly, completely unleash a massive, highly violent torrent of completely unstoppable, deeply murderous maritime chaos.
This highly precarious, completely unstable emotional and psychological balance was brutally, utterly shattered when the Cyclops violently encountered a massively powerful, deeply terrifying, completely unexpected violent storm systems while heavily attempting to navigate the notoriously highly treacherous, deeply dangerous dark waters of the deep mid-Atlantic, abruptly throwing the massive vessel into a truly desperate, extremely violent physical battle for absolute survival against nature. The incredibly dark, completely unforgiving sky rapidly, aggressively turned a highly bruised, deeply sickening shade of violet black, heavily unleashing absolutely torrential, deeply blinding walls of freezing, highly abrasive rain, and massively towering, deeply terrifying, monstrous swells that violently, mercilessly smashed against the heavily groaning, deeply stressed iron hull with the sheer, completely overwhelming force of highly destructive, massive artillery shells. In the absolute terrifying midst of this deeply chaotic, heavily violent natural disaster, instead of rapidly, professionally adopting highly cautious, extremely conservative standard survival maneuvers to actively protect the massively heavy, dangerously top-heavy collier, Captain Worley fully, completely succumbed to his deeply rooted, totally irrational madness, screaming incredibly reckless, completely suicidal orders that highly endangered the absolute lives of absolutely everyone intensely trapped on the highly pitching deck. He completely, aggressively refused to significantly slow the massive engines or heavily alter the highly dangerous course to safely, directly face the massive, highly destructive oncoming waves, fiercely insisting with deeply unhinged, absolute, completely psychotic fanaticism that the deeply frightened, completely battered ship fiercely plows straight ahead at absolute maximum speed, aggressively attempting to completely bend the awesome, absolutely terrifying power of the violent ocean to his utterly deranged, totally unyielding will. The deeply terrified, highly trained officers desperately standing on the wildly pitching, violently shaking command bridge, completely horrified by the incredibly dangerous, totally suicidal trajectory, furiously, desperately screamed highly logical, completely valid warnings heavily over the deafening, completely overwhelming roar of the raging storm, completely ready, highly poised in that absolutely terrifying, deeply desperate moment to fiercely, violently, physically seize total control of the massive ship's heavy steering mechanism to actively prevent a highly imminent, deeply catastrophic total sinking. However, the deeply terrifying, absolutely paralyzing immense weight of deeply ingrained military discipline, aggressively combined with the sheer, completely unpredictable, utterly ferocious, psychotic fury violently blazing in Worley's completely unhinged, utterly manic eyes, caused them to tragically, deeply, fatally hesitate for a profoundly crucial, absolutely critical fraction of a second, entirely backing down in total, completely shameful defeat as the massive, highly vulnerable ship violently, aggressively plunged deeply into another extremely massive, deeply terrifying dark trough. This profoundly terrifying, completely near-death, incredibly violent experience heavily acted as the ultimate, absolutely final, devastating catalyst that finally, completely, violently fractured the deeply fragile, incredibly strained multicultural crew, violently causing the deeply boiling, massively suppressed immense tensions deeply hidden in the lower decks to aggressively, completely, violently explode into outright, deeply bloody physical conflict. The massive, completely unrelenting sheer psychological and physical stress directly caused by the captain's completely insane, utterly reckless driving of the massive ship deeply stripped away absolutely all remaining thin veneers of basic human civility, highly
driven to the absolute, completely undeniable ultimate brink of complete desperation by this massively violent, entirely uncontrollable internal explosion of chaos and totally erratic command. The highly educated, profoundly terrified senior officers finally, completely, desperately convened a deeply secret, highly treasonous, completely clandestine meeting very late in the darkest, most isolated hours of the freezing night. Deeply huddled tightly together in a completely unlit, highly remote, absolutely secure storage locker deeply buried far below the waterline, completely surrounded by highly damp, heavily moldering canvas sails and terribly rusted, massive heavy chains, they fiercely, quietly debated the totally grim, incredibly complex, deeply dangerous legal and moral mechanics of actively, forcefully removing a completely unhinged sitting captain from his absolute command while fully actively at sea. The deeply terrifying, completely agonizing fear of facing a highly strict, totally unforgiving, massive naval court-martial, firmly, completely resulting in highly severe, incredibly long prison sentences, or completely devastating, totally humiliating, dishonorable discharges, fiercely, violently battled against the absolute, totally visceral, entirely undeniable terror of simply, completely, helplessly dying, absolutely pointlessly, under the complete, totally insane direction of a deeply profound madman. They frantically, aggressively discussed methodically, completely compiling a highly detailed, extremely massive secret log, heavily documenting entirely every single bizarre, completely erratic action, totally abusive violent outburst, and deeply reckless, completely dangerous navigational decision, desperately hoping to strongly legally justify a highly desperate, totally sudden violent overthrow should the deeply insane captain fully attempt to completely aggressively sink the highly vulnerable massive vessel. Yet, despite their highly intellectual, deeply desperate, furious planning, a highly, deeply paralyzing, totally profound cowardice, completely firmly rooted in deep, absolute, traditional military subservience, heavily, fundamentally prevented them from entirely, definitively, deeply committing to absolute, total open mutiny, completely, tragically, deeply sealing their ultimate, profoundly inevitable dark fate by heavily choosing entirely passive, deeply fearful total compliance, heavily over decisive, highly necessary violent survival action.
deeply isolated, completely profoundly unaware, or perhaps highly deeply uncaring of the extremely massively dangerous, highly volatile, intense, mutinous plots furiously swirling in the dark bowels of his terribly doomed ship, Captain Worley remained completely, highly, heavily barricaded deeply within the tightly, completely, totally sealed confines of his heavily, entirely dark private cabin. The highly, heavily enclosed space deeply, powerfully reeked absolutely overwhelmingly of highly cheap, extremely harsh gin, heavily stale, profoundly, deeply old tobacco, and the highly pungent, completely unmistakable, terrible odor of highly profound, deeply unwashed, severe paranoid decay, heavily serving as the completely absolute physical manifestation of his highly, entirely, totally fractured, profoundly, completely broken inner psyche. Sitting entirely, completely, absolutely alone under the harsh, extremely sickly, totally weak light of a highly, heavily swinging single, heavily tarnished brass lamp, he violently, furiously, endlessly, furiously, heavily scribbled, completely incomprehensible, totally, highly erratic, deeply insane notes, heavily onto deeply complex, highly, totally stained nautical charts, continuously, constantly, deeply, heavily muttering, entirely, completely, furiously, in heavily, deeply aggressive, totally harsh German to absolutely, completely, absolutely, entirely no one. In his profoundly, completely, deeply, totally distorted, highly, absolutely, severely fractured.
The Atlantic Ocean has always been a dark arena where human hubris and engineering arrogance clashed with the absolute, indifferent, and unpredictable power of nature. And in the cold first days of March 1918, this eternal, unequal struggle would take the form of a silent, inexplicable, and terrifying tragedy as the USS Cyclops continued its grim journey north. This steel colossus, the pride of the American coaling fleet and one of the greatest achievements of naval engineering at the time, cut through the foamy steel-gray waves with ponderous, almost painful determination, its massive hull groaning, creaking and buckling under the crushing, unnatural weight of 10,800 tons of manganese ore. This specific cargo, much denser and more compact than the standard coal the ship was originally designed to carry, caused the ship to settle dangerously low in the water, barely resisting the powerful blows of the ocean's waves, which seemed to strike with greater and greater hidden fury with every kilometer. Each crash of the wave against the rusty plating sounded like a dull, mournful bell, vibrating through the bones and souls of the 306 crew and passengers who felt a growing, irrational sense of hemlock and claustrophobic anxiety with each passing nautical mile. The water around them, instead of a cheerful tropical blue, seemed thick and dark, saturated with inky black and cool navy blue, as if the ocean itself was preparing to swallow this intrusion of steel and coal and fire. In the cavernous engine room, powerful steam engines were working at top speed, spewing out clouds of black, acrid smoke that fell like a long, mournful shroud on the foamy wake, slowly disappearing into the endless, dark void of the receding horizon. The interior of the ship was a stuffy, dark hell where salty sweat mixed with the omnipresent, throat-scratching coal dust and the constant rhythmic clatter of powerful machines seemed to be counting down to the inevitable catastrophe that no one knew about yet, but which everyone subconsciously sensed in the air thick with tension. In these harsh conditions, the journey from Rio de Janeiro, which was supposed to be a routine but extremely important resupply cruise in support of the massive war effort of the United States and its allies on the fronts of bleeding Europe, turned into a slow, psychological agony. The manganese ore itself, critical to the production of durable, reinforcing steel, weighed on the ship like an ancient curse, as if Mother Earth was violently demanding the return of its forcibly wrested treasures, threatening to drag the proud ship into the deepest, unexplored and bitterly cold depths of the Atlantic, where sunlight never reaches and unimaginable pressure would crush the steel bulkheads like broken matches. The unscheduled and much consternation stopover on the island of Barbados was a sudden, drastic turning point in an already anxiety-ridden journey, introducing an element of total chaos and doubt into the rigorous, precisely planned military schedule. As the massive black hull of the USS Cyclops slid slowly into the civilian port of Bridgetown, the contrast between the grim, rusting, smoke-belching war beast and the idyllic, tropically sun-drenched Caribbean landscape of palm trees and colorful buildings was so striking as to be grotesque. The crew, exhausted by days spent on the hostile, constantly heaving ocean, accepted the order to drop anchor with a mixture of momentary relief and deep, growing anxiety, not understanding or accepting the reasons for this sudden, completely unjustified change of course. The sound of huge, rusty anchor chains grating against the metal hawse bars and falling with a mighty splash into the crystal-clear, emerald water echoed.
Sailing beyond the safe, shallow coastal waters of the island of Barbados and entering the open, untamed, and endless Atlantic meant physically and symbolically crossing the invisible border between the known world, bound by the laws of physics, and the dark space that would soon gain the global, gloomy fame of the Bermuda Triangle, a place where human rationality, technology, and science seemed to have completely lost their meaning and power. The water instantly changed color, changing from a luminous, friendly Caribbean green to a terrifying, impenetrable deep shade of ink and dark lead, and the massive waves, though devoid of the destructive fury of the storm, rippled in long, hypnotic, almost predatory and deliberate rhythms, raising and lowering the mighty hull of the USS Cyclops with a disturbing, lethal ease, as if they were playing with a wooden toy. What was astonishing was the fact that there were no dramatic weather warnings, no violent black storms on the horizon, no hurricane-force winds uprooting trees that could in any rational way explain what was about to happen. The weather was unnaturally, gravely calm, and this unprecedented silence and lack of wind were the loudest possible warnings, intensifying the feeling of ominous anticipation to the breaking point. At that historic moment, there were also absolutely no intelligence reports of the presence of enemy deadly German submarines, the famous and fearsome U-boats, in this particular wide operational zone of the Western Atlantic, which clearly meant that the USS Cyclops was not going into a classic battle with a flesh-and-blood enemy or a war machine. The ship had to face a force much more powerful, nameless, older than humanity itself, and completely indifferent to human suffering or military distinctions. The vast, terrifying expanse of ocean surrounded the slow collier on all sides, and the horizon mercilessly merged into one unbroken, misty gray line, trapping the ship in an endless watery desert where the steel Colossus, despite its gargantuan size and naval power, suddenly seemed fragile, as small as a nutshell, and painfully defenseless. Even the mechanical and human sounds on board seemed to be magically muffled by this vast, hostile emptiness. The rhythmic, loud beats of steel pistons, the sound of foaming water brutally cut by the pressing bow, and even the high-pitched cries of seabirds that followed the ship for a short while, hoping for remnants of food. All this was quickly lost in the overwhelming, majestic, and icy silence of the great water. It was this omnipresent silence, this lack of any visible, tangible threat, that made the whole growing situation so unspeakably terrifying. It seemed as if the all-powerful ocean had not had to use its brutal, destructive force at all to destroy what the little man had built. It had only had to silently open its cavernous, dark depths. The last visual memory of the mighty USS Cyclops, forever etched in human history, is an image so deeply rooted in the dark aesthetic of absolute loneliness and hopelessness that it recalls the darkest, most depressing nightmares of nautical painters, framed in the rigid frame of a dirty, faded, grainy, early 20th century photograph. Seen from a great distance,
perhaps by the watch of some nameless ship passing at a safe distance, or by a lonely, melancholy observer standing on the high cliff of the island, the huge coal carrier was becoming, minute by minute, a mere black, jagged, tarry silhouette, slowly and mercilessly devoured by the inexorable growing distance and the completely indifferent, swallowing everything horizon. Its massive, complex steel trusses, high, the 13th day of March 1918 rolled over Baltimore Harbor with slow, lumbering inevitability, bringing with it a thick, impenetrable fog that seemed to choke all the sounds and colors of the awakening waterfront. The water of the Patapsco River, usually teeming with life and the movement of dozens of vessels, this morning resembled thick black tar, lazily and soundlessly washing over the rotten wooden piles of the docks. According to the schedule approved by the United States Navy Command, it is today, in these early frosty morning hours, that the mighty steel hull of the coal carrier USS Cyclops should emerge from the fog, returning from a routine but crucial mission in Brazil and Barbados. Dock workers in thick wool coats and leather gloves gathered in small groups around the braziers, whose orange glow barely penetrated the damp curtain of fumes. Their breath turned into white clouds of steam as they silently stared at the empty horizon, waiting for the distinctive deep roar of the ship's siren that would herald the arrival of a steel colossus of nearly 20,000 tons. The smell of burning coal mixed with the pungent smell of sea salt, rotting seaweed, and wet wood, creating a specific, suffocating atmosphere of waiting. The harbor master's office, located in a brick, turreted building near the main pier, was buzzing with subdued activity. Officials were nervously checking bills of lading and cargo manifests, knowing that the ship was carrying over 10,000 tons of manganese ore, a raw material absolutely critical to the production of the high-grade steel necessary to produce weapons for the troops fighting in the trenches of Europe. With each passing minute, as the hands of the massive clock in the chief dispatcher's office moved inexorably forward, and the thick fog over the Chesapeake Bay failed to reveal even the faintest outline of the coal ship's superstructures, the routine waiting began to take on a subtle, barely perceptible tinge of anxiety that nestled in the minds of seamen, keenly aware that the ocean never forgives mistakes and often mocks the most accurate human schedules. The hours passed, and the sun, although completely hidden behind a thick layer of leaden clouds, reached its zenith and then began to sink towards the west, casting long, gloomy shadows on the deserted quay where the Cyclops should have moored. In port offices, the initial calm gave way to hushed, whispered conversations as experienced sailors and logistics officers tried to rationalize the ship's prolonged absence. Attention was drawn to a well-known documented problem with the coal's starboard steam engine, which forced Captain Worley to reduce the cruising speed earlier in the voyage. People were reminded of the unpredictable whims of the weather around the infamous Cape Hatteras, where sudden storms and treacherous sea currents could slow down even the most powerful units of the fleet. It was argued that the ship was heavily loaded with heavy, lumpy manganese ore, which naturally affected its maneuverability and overall dynamics of movement in the rough waters of the Atlantic. All these logical explanations, based on hard facts and many years of maritime experience, served as a psychological shield to ward off the growing irrational sense of threat. No one was happy with the thought of losing such a valuable ship with 309 souls on board, so port officials' minds instinctively clung to the most mundane scenarios: a failure of the propeller shaft, the need to wait out a storm in a sheltered bay, or even a simple error in navigational calculations. However, as the afternoon slowly faded into a cold, dark,
The transition from a state of delayed expectation to one of creeping institutional dread within the United States Navy was not marked by a single dramatic moment, but rather by a slow, agonizing accumulation of silence. When the USS Cyclops failed to materialize through the gray mists of the Chesapeake Bay on her scheduled arrival date, the initial reaction in Washington was one of mild bureaucratic irritation, easily dismissed by assumptions of minor mechanical failures or cautious detours taken to avoid suspected, though unconfirmed, German U-boat activity. However, as the hours bled endlessly into days and the frantic, incessant wireless calls cast out into the ether by naval stations along the eastern seaboard were met with nothing but the crackling hiss of atmospheric static, that irritation calcified into a profound, chilling alarm. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels and the highest echelons of the Naval Command found themselves confronting an impossibility. A 19,000-ton steel colossus, a vessel longer than a football field, heavily armed, fully crewed by over 300 souls, and laden with 10,000 tons of vital manganese ore, had simply ceased to communicate. In response to this deafening, unnatural silence, the bureaucratic machinery of the Navy Department shifted with grinding urgency, issuing urgent directives that would ultimately launch one of the most extensive, desperate, and ultimately fruitless maritime search operations ever undertaken in the history of the modern world. The mandate was clear, yet dauntingly immense. Scour the entirety of the western Atlantic Ocean, trace the ship's presumed route from the sun-drenched docks of Barbados to the cold industrial harbors of Baltimore, and find the Cyclops, or whatever shattered remnants remained of her. In the austere, smoke-filled map rooms of naval headquarters, the true, terrifying scale of this undertaking became visually apparent. Officers stood in hushed, heavy silence around massive, unrolled nautical charts of the Atlantic, the harsh overhead lights casting long, grim shadows across the paper. With brass compasses and heavy wooden rulers, they began to trace the probable route of the doomed collier, plotting a direct course northward from the West Indies. But the ocean is not a highway with painted lines. It is a chaotic, dynamic expanse subjected to the whims of the powerful Gulf Stream, unpredictable wind shear, and devastating squalls. To account for every variable, a catastrophic engine failure leaving the ship adrift, a desperate change of course to outrun a storm, or an evasive maneuver to escape a phantom submarine, the officers were forced to draw widening cones of probability. These geometric representations of hope and despair expanded inexorably across the chart, swallowing hundreds of thousands of square miles of unforgiving, deep blue void. The search grid stretched across the Caribbean Sea, pushed through the treacherous reef-strewn passages of the Bahamas, and extended out into the deep abyssal trenches of the open Atlantic before tapering toward the eastern seaboard of the United States. Looking at the sprawling web of coordinates, seasoned admirals felt a cold knot tighten in their stomachs. The mathematics of probability were entirely stacked against them. They were attempting to find a microscopic speck of iron lost within a three-dimensional, churning wilderness of water that covered half the globe. The sheer geographical arrogance of attempting to tame and search this chaotic expanse underscored the desperate, almost frantic nature of the mission. They were sending men into the abyss to find a ghost. The physical mobilization of the search fleet was a monumental display of wartime industrial might, a desperate flinging of steel and steam against the uncaring immensity of nature. From naval bases scattered along the eastern seaboard and outposts in the Caribbean, a diverse armada was hastily assembled. A missile line.
In the absence of any tangible evidence, and in the complete, absolute absence of even the smallest piece of wreckage, the grim fate of the giant coal carrier USS Cyclops became, over the decades, a gigantic, dark canvas on which the most extreme, fascinating, and terrifying speculations were painted throughout the century, creating a legend of a scale never before seen in the history of the Navy.
This final, concluding chapter of our story is a deep, analytical, and suspenseful exploration of all the prevailing theories, each of which individually tries to shed a faint light on the impenetrable darkness surrounding the disappearance of 306 souls, meticulously presenting the arguments, circumstantial evidence, testimonies, and logical loopholes that support both their truth and their outright falsehood. The ocean, that vast, indifferent, and inexorable element that has absorbed human ambition since the dawn of time, in the case of this particular ship, turned out to be a treasure trove with such perfect security that to this day it has not returned a single life jacket, not a single damaged lifeboat, not even the smallest oil slick that could indicate the resting place of this steel leviathan. By visualizing this infinite void, we must immerse ourselves in a dark, cinematic, and brutally historical aesthetic, reminiscent of grainy photographs saturated with deep, faded blues and blacks from the early 20th century, where every wave seems to hide a dark secret and a thick, choking fog envelops the minds of those who dare to seek the truth. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops is not a mere anomaly in the maritime records. It is an absolute, terrifying phenomenon that forces us to question the limits of our technological understanding of the world, and is a brutal reminder that when confronted with the power and immensity of nature, human structures, no matter how powerful and modern they may seem on the drawing boards of engineers, are ultimately nothing more than fragile toys floating on the surface of an unimaginable abyss. To fully understand the first, most rational, although equally terrifying theory regarding the tragic end of the USS Cyclops, we must subject to an extremely detailed and merciless analysis the catastrophic technical condition of this gigantic, over 160 meters long ship and the specifics of its murderous, unnatural cargo that it carried in its dock holds. Classified as a Proteus-class coal carrier, the ship was designed, constructed, and optimized from the ground up solely to transport coal, a material with a completely different density, volume, and physical characteristics than what ultimately sealed its fate on the coasts of the Americas. On its final, ill-fated voyage from Rio de Janeiro, the Cyclops was loaded with over 10,800 tons of raw manganese ore, a substance of enormous, crushing density, which filled its bowels unevenly, drastically and irrevocably straining the supporting structure, changing the center of gravity of the entire ship and causing the hull to rest in the water well below Plimsoll's safe, permissible draft line. Moreover, the ship was essentially a technological cripple, forced to traverse the treacherous, unpredictable waters of the Atlantic with one ruined engine after a massive crack was discovered in the cylinder of the starboard steam engine, which not only drastically reduced her top speed, making her slow and sluggish, but also deprived her of the necessary maneuverability in the face of sudden danger. Imagine this claustrophobic, hot as hell, full of steam and grinding metal interior of the engine room, where tired, covered with black dust and dirt, fuelers desperately fought to maintain pressure, while the huge steel frames of the ship constantly groaned and creaked under the unimaginable, unyielding pressure of tens of thousands.